The wedding had been brief and correct and attended by 140 people who all understood to varying degrees that the bride was not the woman the Duke of Ashbourne had intended to marry. This was not a secret. It was simply one of those truths that society absorbs and files away under things we do not mention at dinner, alongside debts that will never be repaid and second sons who drink too much. Alexander Fairfax, the fifth Duke of Ashbourne, had courted Lady Helena Vane for the better part of 2 seasons. He had danced with her at Almack's. He had called on her at her father's house in Mayfair, with the regularity of a man making his intentions visible to everyone whose opinion mattered. He had spoken to her father. He had, by every account that reached the drawing rooms that spring, been within days of a formal proposal. And then Lady Helena had eloped with a cavalry officer she had met at her cousin's house in Hampshire, and Alexander Fairfax had stood in his study at Ashbourne Hall and stared at the letter informing him of this fact for the better part of 20 minutes before setting it down, walking to the window and standing there in silence while the late afternoon light moved across the floor and his valet waited in the hallway, unsure whether to knock. He had proposed to Lady Rose Pemberton 6 weeks later. It was not a cruel decision. It was a practical one, made by a man who had been raised to understand that duty did not wait for the heart to catch up, and that an estate of 11,000 acres and a seat in the House of Lords required a wife and an heir regardless of whether the wife in question made his pulse quicken when she entered a room. Rose Pemberton was the third daughter of the Earl of Waverley. She was 23. She was considered pleasant, well-mannered, and unremarkable, 3 adjectives that, in the language of the marriage market, meant she would not embarrass him and would not be difficult. Her father had accepted the proposal with the contained delight of a man who had not expected to marry his quietest daughter so well, and the terms had been drawn up by solicitors who understood that the generous settlement reflected the Duke's awareness that he was not offering love and wished to compensate accordingly. Rose had understood the arrangement from the moment her father told her. She had sat in the morning room of their house on Upper Brook Street, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to her father explain that the Duke of Ashbourne had made an offer, that the terms were exceptionally favorable, that the match would secure her future and reflect well on the family, and that while the Duke's previous attachment to Lady Helena Vane was widely known, his character was sound and his intentions honorable. "He is a good man, Rose," her father had said, with the particular gentleness of a parent who knows he is asking his child to accept something less than she deserves. "He will not be unkind." Rose had considered this for a moment. Then she had said, "I know he will not be unkind, Papa. That's enough." It was not bravery. It was not resignation. It was something in between. The quiet clarity of a woman who had spent 23 years understanding exactly where she stood in every room she entered and had made her peace with it long before anyone asked her to. She was the third daughter. She was not the beauty. That was Charlotte, the eldest, whose marriage to the Marquis of Hereford had been the triumph of 3 seasons ago. She was not the wit. That was Eleanor, the second, whose sharp tongue and talent for watercolors had secured her a husband who found both qualities charming. Rose was the one who played the pianoforte well enough to be asked, but not well enough to be remembered, who read extensively but spoke about it rarely, who moved through drawing rooms and dinner parties with the kind of composure that people mistook for emptiness because they had never bothered to look closely enough to see what was underneath. What was underneath was a woman who noticed everything, who remembered the name of every servant in every house she visited, who could read a room in 30 seconds and identify who was unhappy, who was pretending, and who was about to say something they would regret, who had spent years watching her sisters receive the kind of attention that makes a young woman visible, and had learned, in the absence of that attention, to build a life that did not depend on being seen. She married the Duke of Ashbourne on a Thursday morning in June in the chapel at Waverley Park, wearing her mother's lace veil and a dress of ivory silk that the dressmaker had called simple, and Rose had called perfect. The ceremony was correct. The breakfast was adequate. The Duke was courteous and distant in the way that a man is courteous and distant when he is performing a duty he has accepted but not chosen, and Rose observed this with the same steady attention she brought to everything, and did not take it personally, because she understood that his distance was not about her. It was about the woman who was not there. They arrived at Ashbourne Hall that evening. The staff lined the entrance hall, 26 of them, from Mrs. Harding the housekeeper to the scullery maid who was 14 and terrified, and the Duke introduced her as the Duchess of Ashbourne, and they curtsied and bowed, and Rose smiled at each of them and said good evening, and noticed that the footman on the far left had a bruise on his wrist and that the second housemaid's eyes were red. The housekeeper showed her to her rooms. They were large, well-appointed, and connected to the Duke's chambers by a door that was closed. Mrs. Harding explained the bell system, the breakfast arrangements, and the location of the library, which she mentioned with particular emphasis, as though someone had told her that the new Duchess liked to read. When Mrs. Harding left, Rose stood in the center of the room and looked at the closed connecting door and the four-poster bed with its cream canopy, and the fire that had been laid and lit, and the dressing table where someone had placed a small vase of white roses, a kindness, she suspected, from Mrs. Harding rather than from the Duke. She changed into her nightgown, dismissed the lady's maid, and sat on the edge of the bed. She waited. She was not sure what she was waiting for, whether he would come through the connecting door, whether she was expected to go to him, whether this was a conversation they were meant to have or a silence they were meant to endure. After 20 minutes, there was a knock, not on the connecting door, on the main door from the hallway. He had walked around, as though the connecting door was a boundary he was not yet willing to cross. "Come in," she said. He entered. He was still dressed, not in his evening clothes, but in a shirt and waistcoat, as though he had removed his coat and stock and then stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. He stood near the doorway with the awkwardness of a man who was 6'1" and accustomed to commanding rooms and did not know what to do with his hands in this particular room on this particular night. "I wanted to see if you had everything you needed," he said. Rose looked at him. She looked at the room, the fire, the roses, the cream canopy, the wardrobe where her dresses had been hung with perfect precision by a lady's maid she had met 3 hours ago. "I have everything I need," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He seemed to be waiting for something, a request, a question, an expression of need that would give him something to respond to, a role to fill. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man who understood roles. He understood duty and obligation and the appropriate response to a clearly stated expectation. What he did not understand was a woman who looked at him with clear eyes and asked for nothing. "Is there anything?" he began. "Nothing," she said, not coldly, not with hurt or reproach or the particular iciness of a woman who wants to be asked again, simply, honestly, as a statement of fact. "I am quite well, Your Grace. Please do not trouble yourself." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded again, said good night, and left through the main door, and his footsteps moved down the hallway toward his own rooms, and Rose listened to them fade, and then sat in the silence and breathed. She did not cry. She had not expected tenderness, and so its absence did not wound her. She had expected exactly what she received: courtesy, distance, a closed door, and she had met it with the same composure she brought to everything, and if there was something underneath the composure that ached, she did not examine it, because examining it would not change it. And she had long ago learned the difference between feelings that could be acted upon and feelings that could only be carried. She blew out the candle and went to sleep. The weeks that followed established a pattern. They breakfasted together because breakfast was a meal that required no performance. One could read correspondence, discuss the weather, and eat toast in companionable silence without anyone expecting more. They dined together when they were both at the hall, which was most evenings, and the conversation was polite and careful and covered estate matters, London news, and the occasional observation about a book, though Rose noticed early that he mentioned books he thought she might like, with a frequency that suggested he was paying more attention to her reading habits than he realized. He did not come to her room again. Not through the connecting door, not through the main door. She did not mention this. He did not mention this. It sat between them like a piece of furniture that both of them walked around without acknowledging, and the staff, who noticed everything, as staff always do, noted it and discussed it in the servants' hall in the careful coded way that servants discuss the private lives of their employers. Rose, meanwhile, began to learn the house. She did it quietly, the way she did everything. She rose early, earlier than the Duke, who kept London hours even in the country, and she walked the grounds with Mrs. Harding, learning the names of the gardens, the history of the outbuildings, the particular temperament of the cook, who was exceptional with pastry and resentful of criticism, and the needs of the tenants on the eastern boundary, who had been asking for roof repairs since the previous autumn, and had been told by the steward that the matter was under consideration. The steward's name was Aldridge. He was efficient, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a duchess who asked questions. Rose asked questions. She asked about the tenant ledgers and the quarterly accounts and the condition of the drainage on the lower fields. She asked through Aldrich, as was proper, and she framed her questions as requests for information rather than challenges to his authority, which was also proper. But Aldrich was experienced enough to recognize that a woman who asked questions with that degree of specificity was not asking out of idle curiosity. She was learning the estate the way a general learns a battlefield, not to fight on it today, but to understand the terrain in case the time came when understanding mattered. By September, 3 things had happened that the Duke did not fully register at the time, but would remember later with the painful clarity of a man who has been given something valuable and did not notice until he nearly lost it. The first was the roof repairs. The tenants on the eastern boundary had their roofs fixed in August, 2 weeks after Rose had mentioned to Aldridge, casually, over a ledger review, that the cost of the repairs was roughly a quarter of what it would cost to replace the families if they left for better maintained properties elsewhere. Aldridge had authorized the work that afternoon. He did not tell the Duke that the Duchess had prompted it. Rose did not tell the Duke either. The roofs were simply repaired, and the tenants wrote a letter of thanks that was addressed to the Duke and placed on his breakfast table, and he read it, and felt vaguely satisfied without understanding why the repairs had finally happened after months of delay. The second was the school. Rose had discovered, during her walks with Mrs. Harding, that the nearest school for the tenants' children was 4 miles away and across a river that flooded every spring. She had spoken to the vicar. She had identified an unused barn on the eastern boundary that could be converted. She had found a woman in the village, a former governess whose husband had died and left her without income, who was willing to teach. She had presented the entire plan to Aldridge in a single meeting, with costs itemized and a proposed schedule for conversion. And Aldridge had looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and alarm and had said he would discuss it with the Duke. The Duke had approved it in a single sentence over breakfast. The school sounds sensible. Tell Aldridge to proceed. And Rose had thanked him and returned to her toast, and he had not noticed that what she had thanked him for was not the approval itself, but the speed of it, which told her that he trusted her judgment, even if he did not yet know he trusted it. The third thing was the pianoforte. Rose played every evening after dinner in the music room at the back of the house where the acoustics were good and the windows faced west and caught the last of the light. She played well, better than well, in fact, better than the pleasant, competent playing she had been known for in London drawing rooms, where she had always modulated her ability downward to avoid drawing the kind of attention that would lead to comparison with Charlotte or Eleanor. At Ashbourne Hall, alone in the music room with the door half open and no audience to perform for, she played as she actually played, with feeling and precision and the kind of technical fluency that comes from years of daily practice by a woman who used music the way other people use conversation, as a way of saying things she could not say aloud. The Duke heard her for the first time in early October. He had been walking from the library to his study and had stopped in the corridor outside the music room, because the sound had physically arrested him, not the melody itself, which was a Beethoven sonata he knew, but the quality of the playing, which was so far beyond what he had expected that he stood in the corridor for the duration of the piece, his hand on the doorframe, not moving, not breathing loudly, not wanting to interrupt. When the piece ended, he walked away before she could see him. He did not mention it at breakfast the next morning, but that evening, after dinner, he did not go to his study. He went to the library, which shared a wall with the music room, and he sat in the chair nearest that wall and opened a book he did not read and listened to his wife play Schubert for 40 minutes. And somewhere during the second movement of the B-flat major sonata, he set the book down on his lap and closed his eyes, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. October became November. The leaves turned and fell, and the mornings grew cold, and the light changed from gold to silver, and Alexander Fairfax began to notice his wife. He did not notice her the way he had noticed Helena. That had been heat and urgency, and the consuming focus of a man who wanted something specific and was pursuing it. This was different. This was the slow, accumulating awareness of someone who had been in the room the entire time, doing remarkable things so quietly that you could miss them entirely if you were not paying attention, and he had not been paying attention, and now that he was, he could not stop. He noticed that she knew every servant's name, not just their surnames, their first names, their children's names, the name of the cook's sister who was ill in Hertfordshire. He noticed that Mrs. Harding deferred to her with a naturalness that suggested genuine respect rather than obligation. He noticed that Aldrich had begun bringing the quarterly accounts to her first and to him second, and that the accounts were annotated in her handwriting with observations so precise that he found himself reading her notes more carefully than the figures themselves. He noticed that she never asked him for anything, not his time, not his attention, not his affection. She did not wait for him in hallways or engineer accidental encounters or leave doors open so that he might wander in. She simply existed, fully, quietly, completely, in the house they shared, and the absence of her need for him began to feel, as the weeks passed, not like indifference, but like the most devastating form of self-sufficiency he had ever encountered. She did not need him. That was the thing that undid him. She had built, in the space of 5 months, a life at Ashbourne Hall that was rich and purposeful and entirely her own. And it did not require his participation and the realization that she could go on like this indefinitely, content, productive, uncomplaining, without him ever becoming more than a polite stranger who shared her breakfast table, filled him with a dread that he recognized after several weeks of denial as the fear of losing something he had not yet earned. In late November, he did something he had never done before. He went to the music room while she was playing. She did not stop when he entered. She looked up, acknowledged him with a small nod, and continued the piece. A Haydn sonata, lighter than the Beethoven and Schubert she usually played in the evenings, as though she had chosen something less exposed for a moment she had not anticipated. He sat in the chair by the window and listened, and when the piece ended, she rested her hands on the keys and looked at him. "You play extraordinarily well," he said. "Thank you. Why did I not know this?" She considered the question. "You did not ask," she said, not with accusation. With the simple factual precision that he was beginning to understand was not emptiness or passivity, but the most honest form of communication he had ever encountered. She said what was true. She did not add performance or subtext or the social padding that most people use to soften the edges of their meaning. She simply said what was true and left it there, and let him do with it what he would. "I'm asking now," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What are you asking, Your Grace?" And he realized that he did not know. He did not know what he was asking, only that he was asking, and that the asking itself was the first honest thing he had done since their wedding day. "I am asking," he said slowly, "whether you would play again, tomorrow evening, and whether I might sit here while you do?" "Of course," she said. "You do not need to ask permission to enter a room in your own house." "I'm not asking permission to enter the room," he said. "I'm asking permission to listen." Something changed in her expression. It was small, a softening at the corners of her eyes, a shift in the set of her mouth. And if he had not been watching carefully, he would have missed it. And he understood with a jolt of shame that he had been missing things exactly like this for 5 months, because he had not been watching carefully, because he had been so occupied with the absence of the woman he had wanted that he had failed to see the woman who was there. "Then yes," she said, "you may listen." He came the next evening, and the evening after that, and every evening through December, while the frost gathered on the windows and the fire crackled in the music-room grate, and Rose played Beethoven and Schubert and Haydn, and, once, a piece she had written herself that was so beautiful and so plainly personal that Alexander sat in the chair by the window and pressed his hand against his mouth to keep from making a sound. They began to talk, not the careful, polite conversation of the breakfast table, but real conversation, the kind that starts with a question and follows wherever the answer leads. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about growing up as the third daughter, about the particular freedom of being the one no one expected anything from, about the way she had learned to notice things because no one was noticing her. He asked about the estate, and she told him what she had done, the roofs, the school, the ledger annotations, and he listened with the growing uncomfortable awareness of a man who is discovering that his house has been running better than he knew, and that the reason was the person he had most thoroughly overlooked. She asked about Helena. She asked directly, without preamble, one evening in the library after dinner, and he answered honestly, because Rose had taught him, simply by being herself, that honesty was the only currency she accepted. "I thought I loved her," he said. "I think now that what I loved was the idea of being chosen. Helena was the woman everyone wanted, and when she seemed to want me, I felt selected, confirmed. When she left, what I lost was not her. It was the feeling of being the one who had been picked." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was never going to make you feel selected." I was always going to be the sensible choice. You were never the sensible choice, he said. You were the choice I was not wise enough to make on purpose. I arrived at you by accident, and it is the accident I am most grateful for and most ashamed of, because you deserved to be chosen deliberately, and I did not give you that. You are giving it now, she said. Is it enough? She looked at him. The fire was low. The library was dark except for the two lamps by their chairs, and in the half-light her face had the quality of a portrait, still, composed, serious, and underneath the composition, alive with everything she had spent 23 years learning to contain. Ask me again in the spring, she said. He waited. He waited through January when the snow came and the roads were impassable for a week, and they spent 4 days in the library reading aloud to each other, Fielding and Richardson, and on Rose's insistence, Mary Wollstonecraft, which led to an argument so vigorous and so enjoyable that Alexander found himself laughing for the first time in months. He waited through February, when Rose caught a chill that kept her in bed for 3 days, and he paced the hallway outside her room until Mrs. Harding told him, with the firm kindness of a woman who had served 3 duchesses, that he might simply go in and sit with her, which he did, reading to her from the Wollstonecraft because he knew she would argue with him even with a fever, and the arguing would distract her from the discomfort. He waited through March, when the first crocuses appeared in the south garden and the tenants' children started at the school Rose had built, and she walked down to see them on the first morning and stood at the back of the converted barn and watched 12 children sit at wooden desks and open books and the former governess write the alphabet on a board, and Rose's face did something Alexander had never seen it do before. It broke open, not with sadness, with the unguarded, uncontained joy of a woman who has made something real and lasting and good, and who, for once, is not moderating the feeling for an audience. He was standing behind her. She did not know he was there. He had followed her down from the hall because he had wanted to see it, the school, the children, the thing she had built, and he had arrived just as she had, and he had stood in the doorway and watched her watching the children, and in that moment he understood something with the force of a physical blow. He was in love with her, not falling. He had fallen months ago, somewhere between the Haydn sonata and the argument about Wollstonecraft. He was in love with her, completely and irreversibly, and the love was not the consuming, acquisitive heat he had felt for Helena. It was something quieter and deeper and far more frightening, because it was built on knowledge rather than desire, on months of watching her be herself, unflinching and unperforming, and finding every single thing he saw to be more than he deserved. She turned and saw him. Her expression shifted, surprise, then a flicker of something she quickly contained, then the composure she wore like armor settling back into place. "You followed me," she said. "I did." "Why?" "Because it is spring," he said. "And you told me to ask you again in the spring." She was quiet. The children's voices were audible behind her, the alphabet recited in uneven chorus by 12 small voices that would not exist in this room if Rose Pemberton had not imagined them there. "Then ask," she said. He stepped forward. He took her hands, the first time he had touched her since the wedding, since the brief formal clasp in the chapel when the vicar had told them they were married. Her hands were cold from the March air, and he held them between his own and looked at her and said the thing he should have said on their wedding night, the thing he should have said when she told him she needed nothing, the thing he should have said every day of the 5 months during which she had quietly, patiently, without complaint, shown him who she was while he was too blind and too proud and too consumed with his own disappointment to look. "I need you," he said. "Not your competence, though it humbles me. Not your music, though it undoes me. Not the school or the ledgers or the roofs, though all of them are better than anything I could have done alone. I need you. Your company, your honesty, your patience, the way you see things I miss, the way you sit in a room and make it feel inhabited. I need you to ask me for things, anything, everything, because the fact that you have never asked me for anything is the thing that keeps me awake at night. I want to give you things. I want to be asked. I am asking you to ask." Rose looked at their joined hands. She looked up at him, and for the first time she did not contain what she felt. She let it show. All of it, the months of composure and patience and quiet hoping, and the steady, stubborn refusal to beg for something that should be offered freely. And it moved across her face like weather, like light, like the breaking of a surface that had been still for so long that the movement itself was a kind of revelation. "I would like," she said very quietly, "for you to call me Rose." He laughed. It was not the laugh she had heard from across rooms or over dinner, the polished, appropriate laugh of a duke performing ease. It was the laugh of a man caught off guard by something so small and so enormous that his body did not know how to process it except through sound. "Rose," he said, "and I would like," she continued, "for you to come through the connecting door. Not around through the hallway, through the door. Rose, and I would like you to sit in the music room tomorrow evening, and the evening after, and every evening you wish to. And I would like you to stop pretending you are reading a book in the library when you are listening through the wall, because I have known about that since October, and it is somewhat distracting." He stared at her. "You knew." "The library chair creaks," she said. "You shift your weight when the tempo changes. I have been playing to the rhythm of your shifting for 4 months." He lifted her hands and pressed them against his forehead, and stood like that, bent slightly, his eyes closed, her cold fingers against his brow, and he said her name again and again until the word stopped sounding like a name and started sounding like something older and more necessary, like breath, like the first word a person learns, like the sound that means I am here, and I see you, and I'm not leaving. They walked back to the hall together. He did not take her arm. He took her hand, which was different, less formal, more deliberate, the choice of a man who wanted contact rather than ceremony. The gardener saw them from across the south lawn and later told Mrs. Harding, who told the cook, who told the scullery maid, who was no longer 14 and no longer terrified, and who said, with the authority of someone who had been watching the situation develop for 5 months, "About time." That evening, he came through the connecting door. He knocked first. She said, "Come in." And what followed was not the performance of duty that Rose had expected on their wedding night and Alexander had dreaded. It was the tentative, honest, imperfect beginning of something that had been building since the first morning she sat across from him at the breakfast table and did not ask for a single thing. By summer, the pattern of their life had changed so completely that visitors who had known the Duke before his marriage assumed they were witnessing a long and devoted union rather than one that was barely a year old. They walked the grounds together. They read together in the library, the same room now, not through a wall. She played for him every evening, and he no longer pretended not to listen. He sat in the music room openly, sometimes with a book, sometimes without. And once, on a warm evening in July when the windows were open and the scent of the garden came through, he fell asleep in the chair, and she played on, softly, shifting to something gentler so as not to wake him. And Mrs. Harding found them an hour later, him asleep, her still playing, the candles burned low, and closed the door without a word. He spoke in the House of Lords that autumn on a bill concerning the education of children in rural parishes. He cited the school at Ashbourne as evidence that small interventions could produce substantial results, and he credited the initiative, in the chamber and on the record, to the Duchess of Ashbourne. And 2 lords looked startled and 1 looked impressed, and the bill passed its second reading by a comfortable margin. Lady Helena, now Mrs. Villiers, wife of the cavalry officer, was seen occasionally in London at events Rose and Alexander did not attend. Reports reached Ashbourne Hall through the circuitous channels by which all gossip eventually arrives at country houses, that the marriage was not unhappy, but not what Helena had imagined, that the cavalry officer's charm had proven more suited to drawing rooms than to daily life, that Helena sometimes wore an expression at dinner that people who knew her well described as the look of a woman recalculating. Rose heard these reports and felt nothing personal about them. No triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication. She felt only the distant, impersonal recognition that choices have consequences, and that the consequences of Helena's choice and Alexander's choice and her own choice had led, by routes none of them could have predicted, to exactly where each of them now stood. Their first child was born the following spring, a daughter whom they named Elizabeth after Rose's mother. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stillness, and she slept through the night from 6 weeks old with a regularity that the nursemaid declared unprecedented, and Rose attributed to temperament rather than luck. Their son arrived 2 years later, William, a louder and more restless child who cried often and laughed often and seemed to experience every sensation at twice the volume of ordinary life. Alexander carried him through the house in the evenings when he would not settle, walking from room to room in a circuit that always ended in the music room, where Rose would play something slow and low until the boy quieted, and this became their ritual. The 3 of them, then the 4 of them, then eventually just the 2 of them again, Rose at the pianoforte and Alexander in the chair by the window, the children asleep upstairs, the house settled around them like a coat that fits. Years later, when Elizabeth was old enough to ask, she asked her mother how she had known that her father would come around, how she had known that the man who married her out of duty would learn to love her, how she had known to wait. Rose considered the question for a long time before answering. They were sitting in the music room, the same pianoforte, the same chair by the window, though the upholstery had been replaced twice and the window frame once. "I did not know," she said. "I hoped, but I did not know. What I knew was that I could not make him love me by asking for it. Love that is demanded is not love. It is compliance. So I decided to be myself, fully and honestly, and to let that be enough. And if it was not enough for him, then it would still be enough for me. That was the part that mattered, not whether he chose me, whether I chose myself." Elizabeth thought about this. "But he did choose you," she said. "Yes," Rose said. "But by then I'd already chosen myself. And that, I think, is why it worked. He was not rescuing someone who was waiting to be saved. He was joining someone who was already whole." She turned to the pianoforte and played something. Schubert, the B-flat major, the piece she had played on the evening Alexander first sat in the library and listened through the wall. The notes filled the room the way they always did, with the particular quality that music has when it is played by someone who is not performing, but simply speaking, saying in sound what cannot be said in words. Through the wall, if Elizabeth had listened closely, she might have heard the library chair creak. Some habits, it turns out, outlast everything, even the need for them. If this story found you at the right moment, the next one will too. They arrive here, quietly, like a woman who walks into a room and changes everything without raising her voice.